What if the world didn't turn against America with protests, speeches, or dramatic headlines? What if it simply stopped showing up? No flags burned, no embassies stormed, no official boycotts announced, just fewer people booking flights, fewer companies investing, fewer allies picking up the phone. For decades, the United States sat at the center of the global system. Travel flowed in, money flowed in, influence followed naturally. But sometime over the last few years, something changed. And in 2025, the data finally made it impossible to ignore. Airports grew quieter, hotel rooms stayed empty, trade partners quietly recalculated, not because America suddenly became poor, not because it lost military power, but because trust began to drain away. And once trust disappears, the world doesn't argue, it adjusts. What's happening now isn't loud, it isn't theatrical, but it may be the most consequential shift in global power we've seen in a generation, because the world isn't confronting America anymore. It's moving on without it. And the first place this shift became visible wasn't politics or war, it was travel. The earliest warning signs didn't come from governments, they came from behavior. By mid 2025, international travel data revealed something unusual. While Europe, Asia, and the Middle East were enjoying post pandemic tourism booms, one country stood out for the wrong reason: the United States. Foreign visitor spending was shrinking, making America the only major destination moving backward while the rest of the world surged forward. At first, analysts thought it was a blip: inflation, exchange rates, airline capacity, but the decline didn't reverse. It accelerated. Arrivals from Europe softened, Asia followed, Africa dipped, and Canada, America's most reliable source of visitors, fell sharply. Billions in lost spending were confirmed by global tourism bodies. Airports that once felt crowded now felt hollow. Hotels in major cities reported weaker occupancy despite aggressive discounts. What made this especially alarming was why people weren't coming. It wasn't cost, it was feeling. Researchers described it as a sentiment collapse, a loss of emotional comfort tied to unpredictability. Tougher visa rules, revived travel bans, border checks that felt hostile rather than routine. No country declared a boycott, but behavior mirrored one perfectly. And the clearest example of this emotional shift came from the country that knows America best. Canada didn't slam the door, it simply stopped walking through it. For 9 consecutive months, Canadian travel to the United States declined, despite a favorable exchange rate that should have encouraged shopping trips, vacations, and seasonal stays. That alone raised eyebrows. But border towns from Buffalo to Montana began reporting something far more troubling: some of the weakest tourism seasons in decades. Snowbirds who had spent winters in Florida and Arizona for years quietly changed plans. Retirees who owned U.S. property started looking elsewhere: Mexico, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia. Why? It wasn't money, it was tone. Remarks about Canada's sovereignty landed badly. New fingerprinting rules for longer stays frustrated people who had crossed the border for decades without issue. What once felt like a friendly crossing now felt like an interrogation. And then came a moment that symbolized the shift perfectly. For the first time in nearly 20 years, excluding pandemic anomalies, more Americans drove north into Canada than Canadians traveled south. That statistic mattered, not because Canada turned hostile, but because it turned inward. Canadians didn't protest. They didn't boycott loudly. They simply redirected their time, money, and attention elsewhere. And if America's closest ally could emotionally disengage this quietly, it raised a far bigger question. What about Europe? Europe's shift wasn't emotional, it was strategic. Across the Atlantic, the relationship with Washington began changing in subtle but unmistakable ways. Travel agencies reported sustained declines in U.S. bookings. Migration patterns showed fewer Europeans moving to America and more Americans relocating to Europe. But the deeper change wasn't about tourism, it was about alignment. Long standing assumptions that the United States would always anchor Western unity started to wobble. European leaders watched Washington take positions that felt erratic, transactional, and sometimes openly dismissive of alliance norms. There's been growing discussion, some public, some behind closed doors, about reducing dependence on U.S. leadership altogether. Germany's political rhetoric shifted toward autonomy. France openly explored the idea of extending its own security guarantees across Europe. New defense groupings formed with less emphasis on American coordination. Europe wasn't cutting ties, it was preparing for absence. The language mattered. Leaders weren't talking about rebellion, they were talking about insurance, about resilience, about not putting every strategic egg in one unpredictable basket. And as Europe quietly reorganized, another region began doing the same, without headlines, speeches, or drama. Asia's pullback didn't make noise. It made spreadsheets. For decades, the United States had been a top destination for Asian tourists, students, executives, and conference organizers. That pipeline quietly thinned in 2025. Long-haul travel weakened across Japan, South Korea, India, and China. Families reconsidered vacations. Students explored alternatives. Corporations changed venues. The official reasons sounded technical. A stronger dollar, higher airfare, more complex visa rules, new fees that made entry feel bureaucratic and political. But the unofficial reason kept appearing in surveys: uncertainty. Travel boards across Asia began promoting regional destinations instead, and those campaigns worked. Conferences moved to Singapore, Tokyo, Dubai, and Seoul. Students chose Canada, Australia, and the UK, where policy felt steadier. China's visitor numbers remained far below pre-pandemic levels, influenced by tighter screening and persistent political friction. Asia wasn't rejecting America, it was de-risking it. And then came the accelerant that pushed hesitation into action: tariffs. If travel trends revealed the world's emotions, tariffs exposed its breaking point. When the United States rolled out sweeping tariff measures, the shock wasn't just economic, it was psychological. These weren't aimed at rivals on the margins. They landed squarely on allies that had spent decades aligning their industries, supply chains, and security interests with Washington. Europe reacted first. Officials warned that the measures would ripple far beyond steel or aluminum, potentially destabilizing global markets. Countermeasures were discussed openly, not as a threat, but as a necessity. Markets dipped almost immediately, and economists began whispering the same word no leader wanted to hear: recession. Australia, a cornerstone partner in the Pacific, was caught off guard. Despite years of strategic cooperation, it found itself penalized without warning. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty no longer guaranteed insulation. Japan felt the pressure next, with tariffs touching sensitive automotive and technology sectors that form the backbone of its export economy. Then came Canada's move. Trade talks didn't stall, they stopped. Not with fireworks or public outrage, but with a cold pause that signaled something deeper than disagreement. Confidence had been shaken. What unnerved allies most wasn't the cost. It was unpredictability. Agreements that once felt stable suddenly looked conditional. Long-term planning became harder. Risk assessments grew heavier. And when uncertainty rises, behavior changes fast. Multinational corporations responded quietly but decisively. Supply chains were diversified. New factories were planned elsewhere. Exposure to U.S. policy swings was reduced, not out of protest, but out of caution. No one was trying to punish America. They were trying to protect themselves. And in doing so, they accelerated a shift already underway, one where the world stopped centering its future around a single volatile anchor. Because when predictability disappears, even allies start looking for exits. Individually, none of these changes look catastrophic. A dip in tourism here, a trade dispute there, a few allies talking about strategic autonomy. But when you line them up, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The world isn't reacting emotionally anymore. It's recalculating rationally. Governments, corporations, and even individuals are doing the same quiet math. What happens if the United States changes course again tomorrow? That question alone is reshaping behavior. Travelers choose destinations where entry rules won't shift overnight. Students pick universities in countries where policy feels stable. Corporations spread supply chains across regions to avoid being caught in the crossfire of sudden tariffs or regulatory swings. None of this is dramatic. That's the point. This isn't a revolt, it's risk management. For decades, America's greatest strength wasn't just military power or market size, it was predictability. Allies could plan years ahead knowing the rules would mostly hold. That confidence allowed the U.S. to sit comfortably at the center of global systems. Now, that assumption is fading. European leaders are strengthening regional defense structures. Asian economies are building alternative trade corridors. Even long-trusted partners are designing plans that work without Washington's involvement, just in case. Not because they want to leave, but because they don't want to be trapped. What makes this moment dangerous for American influence is how quietly it's happening. There are no dramatic exits, no declarations of independence, just slow, deliberate adjustments that reduce reliance over time. And once reliance disappears, leverage goes with it. That's the reality few are willing to say out loud. Influence doesn't vanish in a single moment. It erodes as options multiply elsewhere, which leads to the question hanging over everything now. If the world has already learned how to operate without America at the center, what happens when it decides it no longer needs to return? What's happening right now isn't a dramatic collapse of American power. It's something far more unsettling. The world is learning how to function without America at the center, and it's discovering that it can. No speeches announced this shift. No summit declared it official. Instead, it unfolded through thousands of small decisions. A traveler choosing a different destination, a company rerouting a supply chain, a government building a backup alliance just in case. On the surface, it looks like tourism numbers and trade disputes. Underneath, it's a renegotiation of trust. For decades, the United States wasn't just powerful, it was predictable. Allies planned around it, markets relied on it, people felt safe engaging with it. That consistency created gravity. Now that gravity is weakening, not because America vanished, but because unpredictability crept in. The most dangerous part for US influence isn't criticism, it's indifference. When countries stop reacting emotionally and start adapting structurally, the shift becomes harder to reverse. And that's where we are now. Europe is preparing to stand on its own. Asia is building parallel paths. Canada is quietly turning inward. Corporations are hedging. People are choosing alternatives. None of this means America is finished, but it does mean the old assumption that the world will always orbit Washington by default no longer holds. The real question isn't whether the United States can rebuild trust, it's whether it can do so before the world fully adjusts to life without it. Because once systems are rebuilt, habits change, and once habits change, influence doesn't snap back. It has to be earned again. So what do you think? Is this a temporary backlash driven by short-term policy chaos, or the early stages of a deeper global realignment? And if the world no longer needs a single center, what replaces it? That question may define the next decade. This is Dollar Under Fire. And the fire isn't loud, it's quiet, it's strategic, and it's already reshaping the world.